So the overview of the things I wanted to talk about today, the first thing was symptoms, problems, and solutions, which is really sort of how we talk about changing closure, and look at JIRAs and try to think about things. Some just general process stuff about how closure stuff works, how you can help. And if at the end, if we want to do some Q&A, that's fine too. So a lot of times bug reports that come in, usually through Ask Closure these days, are really in terms of symptoms. So they're, I tried to do something and it didn't work. So good symptom descriptions include what they're trying to do. And I'd say that's the number one most important thing. And it's often one of the most commonly omitted from the description. So as you're looking at this, sometimes sometimes it's the user genuinely trying to help by creating a very narrow reproduction of their original problem. So as they do that, they'll winnow down to something very small. Sometimes that's helpful, but it's often also useful to know, like, what were you doing originally? Like, what were you trying to do originally? And so having both is actually pretty useful. But that's something to be aware of. So you want to know what they did. Ideally, they might have done more than one thing. So sometimes it's useful to know the set of things that they did. You want to know what happened, and you want to know what they expected to happen, because that's why they think there's a bug and they're filing something. It's because there's some difference between what happened and what they expected to happen, and a lot of times one or the other is not clear. So when I'm looking at good problem reports, or I'm looking for symptoms that have these characteristics. Often it's also useful if they have tried things, they might have tried things that made the problem go away. And if they happen to have noticed that, that's awfully useful to know about. So that's also something I try to look out for. And I think another thing might be workarounds. If they not necessarily something that made the problem go away, but a way that they got past the problem. Problems. So often the thing that the user is experiencing is not the actual problem. And if you take one thing away from this whole talk, this is the whole game, is trying to get to a real description of the problem that occurred. And this is particularly important for things that are improvements or new features, rather than, like, a lot of times with bugs, like, the problem is that there's a bug. So the code is wrong. So that's not a particularly interesting problem. But when we start to think about bigger things that cross, especially across, larger feature sets or problems or things like that, we're really looking at trying to understand the real root cause of what is wrong, what is missing, what abstraction is missing, things like that. And so, like, sometimes you'll hear the 5 whys as one technique for this. Is like, the user saw this, well, why did they see that? Oh, because this thing happened. Or why did they see that? Well, because this thing happened. And eventually you bottom out in something like, at some point you'll bottom out in, like, some process allowed this bad code to be written in the first place. But so once you got to that point, you're probably far enough. So it focuses on, he and I spend a lot of time with Rich working in this area and trying to get at a really clear description of the actual problem that's independent from whatever solutions might be out there. And this is the whole ballgame. So if you're going to focus on making tickets better, this is the #1 best way to help with that. And it's hard. It's an iterative process, and sometimes it helps to get a second opinion from somebody else, or a third opinion even. And I'd say this is the part where we actually spend, in some ways, the most time. It's also good to make presumptions or assumptions explicit if those aren't already explicit. Mention that. So solutions, once we find the problem, you ideally could come up with multiple approaches that could fix the root problem and alleviate the symptoms. And so it's important, like finding the right problem is important to be able to come up to generate good solutions, and then evaluate those solutions on hopefully multiple dimensions. A lot of times we'll get JIRAs that come in that are, improvement JIRAs that come in that say things like add a new arity to whatever. So that is a solution. that's a thing that you can change that will do something, but it's telling you nothing about the problem, right? Like you want to add a new arity to this function because you're trying to do something for the purposes of something. Like the whole problem is unstated if you get an improvement JIRA like that, and we have lots and lots of those in the system. And those tend, like I said, those tend to be more on the improvement tickets than on the bug tickets. But you see them there too. Like you'll see a bug where it says just fix whatever. Those are things that we generally try to change and really try to get at, like, what is the problem that the user is trying to, like, what are they trying to do that they're not able to do with what we currently have?
Hey, Alex, I'd like to chime in just a second. I think that when tickets like this do have problems, they tend to be of the form closure doesn't have X. And then the solution is here's an X, add an X. And so that's good as a first swing, but it never serves as a problem, which I've learned the hard way numerous times when going through this process myself.
Yep. So like an example that Rich likes to use is, a symptom might be, I've got a headache, and you might immediately say, well, the problem is you've got a headache, so your solution is to take some aspirin. But the problem is what if that's not the real problem? Like you're still in symptom and solution space. Like maybe the real problem is that your eyeglass prescription is off, and that's giving you a headache. In that case, you haven't identified the real problem. The headache is not a real problem, that's a symptom, right? And so you want to keep digging down until you get to the real problem, and then you can evaluate multiple things. You might take an aspirin that temporarily relieves the symptoms, but doesn't actually fix the problem. Like the real problem is going to the eye doctor and getting a new prescription or whatever. So you have to keep digging until you think you've really gotten to the real problem there. So ideally, when we work on, especially improvements, bugs, like you'll see in the JIRAs that a lot of problem JIRAs don't have, or bug JIRAs don't have multiple alternatives considered. Sometimes that's because you just find that there's a bug in the code. So it's just a matter of fixing the bug. But the improvement and feature ones definitely should. And you want to try to come up with some alternatives. You want to try to come up with different dimensions on which to compare the alternatives. And this is its own whole thing. I'm not going to get into a lot of description about that. But things you tend to look for are, if you've got two columns that have the same sort of answer for everything, then you're missing some differentiating dimension. So you need to add some rows. If you've got sort of the same, if they are equally good, and if there's something that's all good or all bad, you're probably missing dimensions. And a lot of times what we're looking for is, like for the thorny problems, you tend to end up with cases where there are trade-offs, where like there's good parts of one solution and good parts of another solution, but also bad parts of both of them. So then it's a matter of like, a lot of times that's a pointer to, is there some novel way that we can combine the two things that have good aspects to them? And that's where we've come up with some novel things in Clojure, is exactly in that case. So those are just like words that we use to talk about these things and the ways we think about them. This is a workflow diagram. This is out on the Clojure website. And I actually made this diagram on the very first day that I joined the Clojure team back in 2013. It's been modified a little bit since then. I think it probably needs a little bit more modification, but it's basically a result of conversations we had back on that day. And it's been mostly how we've worked on Jira's for a long time. So generally issues come in at the top and flow down to the bottom. Each of these nodes in the graph is effectively a queue, which is represented by, and there are Jira reports that represent each of these, that sort of act as that queue. The colored boxes are basically processes that we identified. In practice, most of the blue ones and a lot of the orange one, a lot of these are done by, often done by focus design, and that's where we could use help. And then the green ones are mostly rich. And you can think about this from a big picture as, is this a good problem report? Is it a good problem? And is it a good solution? That's kind of the three big questions we're trying to answer as we move through this process. So you come in as an open ticket. Triage, it says here problem good, but I think I'd really say, is the report good? Like, I really want to know, like, is this a good description of a problem that we could actually work on? It doesn't have to be a good problem, it just has to have good symptoms, basically. I want to know, and well, I've got some stuff on that later. We'll talk about that more. Sometimes we go through this pre-screening process where we'll actually do work on the solution before Rich ever looks at it. That's kind of that's just something that we found is sometimes useful as a way to, because vetting occurs, just periodically, it allows us sometimes to sort of create a sort of a more greased path through the process. So tickets sometimes, by the time Rich first looks at them, they're ready to move almost to the end. So that's just sort of a side thing. That's something that we added a few years ago, and I occasionally do. Vetting here is stated as a rich process, but I'd say there's really an opportunity for us to do cleanup on it. And that's kind of where I'm asking for help the most, is sort of to do a community level vetting before Rich does his vetting. And really the vetting that he does is really more, really now more of the release assignment aspect of it. So Focus and I have been trying to go through Jira's and scope out a set of them to give to Rich about once a month. And so we have an initial set for 1.12 that we put together. And so that's where we could really use a hand, is making sure that those tickets are in good enough shape for Rich to look at as the first sort of gate to get into the system to work on it. Once it goes to Rich, then he will mark it if he thinks it's a good thing that we should do. A good problem to work on. He'll mark it as vetted and target it to the next release. At that point, it really depends on what exists on the ticket already. Sometimes those tickets have patches. Sometimes they don't. If they do have a patch, then it gets dumped into the screenable queue. It's basically, there's a proposed solution there. Is it any good? Often tickets at that point need work. So if it doesn't have a patch, then it gets dumped into the needs patch queue. At some point, somebody does work on it, makes a patch, adds it to it, then it gets dumped into screenable. Screening is something that generally Focus and I do. I'll talk later about how you can help with that. And there we're sort of evaluating, the solutions considered, the solution that was chosen, the patch that was added, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty common for that to then get dumped into either incomplete or sort of what happens in this sort of cycle and this sort of development phase is a little murky. We kind of tend to, there's fewer tickets that are sort of in this process, and we sort of move them around a lot once they get in here. But the goal is to move things from incomplete back into something screenable by fixing whatever needed to be fixed with the patch. And it's not uncommon to go through 6-7 patches for an issue before we get to a thing that we let Rich look at. So that's not a reflection on the community. Those are often Focus and I doing multiple patches, so we'll go back and forth many times before Rich looks at it, and then Rich is going to screen it and look at it, and he may kick it back to that process, and we'll, he's got feedback, and we'll start that over again. So that's just how things go. And then eventually he will mark things as okay, which basically means they're free to commit. For a long time, that committing and releasing process was done by Stu. I've been doing that for the last year or so. But that's core team stuff, basically. And then once they get in, then we cut a release. So that's kind of the overall process here. I've talked about there's sort of 3 main issue types: bug, improvement, and feature. There are some other things in the system, but those are the 3 that we basically use. And we really try to mostly focus on bugs, and then we really don't look at the improvement and feature stuff quite as frequently. Still trying to figure out the best sort of way to move through those. We've been using the Ask Closure voting functionality to find bugs, improvements, and features that are important, that people care about, that we should be looking at. Sometimes we end up working on those sort of outside of JIRA. It really depends what we pick out. So as far as processes go, I want to talk about triage, vetting, and screening. And all of these have more words on this screening tickets page, which kind of covers all 3 of these processes. There's really a lot of overlap, so I put them all on the same page. So triage is really about taking new reports and making them into good reports. So typically you're starting from something that's that's in open state. And there are actually lots of tickets in closure that are in that state that have not been triaged. So if you want to work on those, that would be fine. I'd be perfectly okay with people working on those and try to improve them. I do go through old tickets periodically and try to see whether those are still problems, and are they, I do clean these a little, but probably more work could be done. But these are just the questions that we had before with symptoms. So it's really about, a lot of time, like one of the big things you want to ask is like, the user expected something to happen and something different happened. Are the user's expectations actually correct? Like maybe their expectation was wrong, and that's why they saw something different. In that case, sometimes it means that there's a doc string. Maybe that's the issue is really a doc string change, or it should really be a ticket on the closure website where the documentation there should be different or something like that. So sometimes that still ends up being an issue, but it's a different kind of issue. Are the symptoms reproducible? So, you know, can you say that, you know, can you reproduce it on your own system? It's often useful to sort of capture the version information about where it's happening. And like, if you can check older versions and see whether, you know, it happens on, you know, when did it start happening? If you can, you know, sort of bisect to that, sometimes that's useful. Is the scope of impact clear? So like, is this a thing that's just only happens in very specific with specific kinds of data? Like it only happens with negative numbers, or it only happens with long max value or something like that. Like that's an important piece of information. And then is this a duplicate? So, and there definitely are duplicates in the system. It is one of those things where sometimes until you have identified the actual problem, sometimes it's hard to tell which tickets are duplicates. So sometimes it will happen where like we're looking at a problem, you know, an issue, and we find out what the real problem is. And then I'm able to go back through JIRA and find many instances of this problem logged as other things. Like that's a pretty common case. So finding those kinds of things is actually pretty useful. Once you have looked at all this stuff, you sort of have options. You can update the issue to clarify the parts of the description that are, you know, need help. You might need to ask questions of the original poster. You can just leave comments. It's kind of, some of this is kind of is going to be up to you about how comfortable you feel editing the issue. With things that are in open state, I'm mostly fine if you update the issue itself. If you're not sure, you can always add a comment. Like there's never a problem with adding a comment on a JIRA issue. So that's always fine. If you want to update the issue, then I think you should generally be pretty sure what you're updating. So if you're not sure, then you should either ask it as a comment, or you should go to the Closure Dev Room on Slack and ask it there. That's fine too. And if you are pretty certain that what you're doing is correct, you can just mark it as triage. That's fine. Like, yes, this is a good report. I've fixed it and made it better. Just mark it as triaged. So if you're a little less sure about working on closure tickets, but you want to try to help, this is a good place you could help. Just go to the open thing, try to make sure it's a good problem report, mark it as triage. Vetting is kind of the area where we could particularly use some help right now. And here it's really about whether this ticket is describing a good problem. So is there a problem listed at all? So something that comes in as a user space problem might really be symptoms. And so the problem might not be correctly listed. Eric asked if there was a question about a pre-triage queue. So that's really the open JIRA report. So there's a CLJ open. And I think I have links to these later on. So there are queues for all those things. There are existing reports for that. So in vetting, we're really trying to form as much of the description, the issue description that's about the problem as possible. We're trying to make that well formed. It's not as important whether there's a solution or a patch. You don't need to evaluate the patch. Don't need to evaluate the solution. Any of those things. So that's not as critical. we'll start to work on that once we get into sort of the dev. Once Rich decides that it's a problem we should work on, that's when we really usually start to focus on that stuff. So your actions here are basically to either update the issue to make it better or to add a comment. And like I said, I have some links later I'll talk about for where to do that. Screening is really about whether it's a good solution. Once you get into screening, I would request that you really have a lot more communication with Focus and I, because we're usually things in screening are things that we are actively looking at. So if you are going to be making a lot of changes or think something really needs to be changed there, please make comments or talk to us like in Slack or something like that, so that we can make sure that you're not overlapping with. We might be actively working on it in some way. So so the question here is really about whether this is a good solution. At this point, the problem should be super clear. That should have already happened through the vetting process, but sometimes you learn more as you start to work on solutions. There should ideally be multiple solutions listed. There should be some proposed solution out of those. It should be really clear what's being proposed, why it's being proposed. If it's one particular alternative, why is that one being picked? And there should be a description that covers the patch, so that if I read the proposed solution and then I go look at the patch, I should not be surprised by anything. So if the patch touches 3 different parts of the code, I really want those 3 things to be mentioned in the proposed solution, so that, like, in general, if I read the patch, that nothing should be surprising. Once I get to that point, I should already understand what the problem is, what problem we're trying to fix, what the solution is that we propose, and how we're fixing it. And the patches should be obvious at that point in most ways. It is really helpful to list the name of the patch that is under consideration, even if there's only one patch attached to the ticket. I know that seems silly, but it is very easy to have a second patch added to the ticket, and then the first patch is not listed, and so nobody updates the description, and then it's confusing. So it's not confusing until it's confusing, which is almost immediately. So that's really helpful. Perf is an area where we often need benchmarks and things like that, and we want enough code that we can reproduce the thing on a, maybe it won't get looked at for 6 months or a year or something like that. You don't know. And so it really is useful to, if you have numbers, you should at least say what Clojure and Java version you're using at a minimum. And you should have enough code that we can reproduce the benchmark later. How you attach the Perch benchmark code is, I'm flexible with, but if you can put it in the ticket or as an attachment, that's awfully helpful. External repos or gists are, I'd say, slightly less good, but better than nothing. But as minimal as possible, so that they, we can rerun them later, is awfully useful. Like I said, I prefer that you mostly stick to comments unless you've communicated with us and we've told you something else. And if you have, that's fine. It's not like you're not allowed to work on this, but I would prefer that we communicate about it. Editing Jira is publicly readable. Because it's a cloud instance and we have a finite number of users that we can add to the system. It's a donated instance that we have. So there are some limits there. So generally we reserve access to Jira edits for contributors that are actually working on something. So if you're in this meeting, then you're probably interested enough in working on tickets that it's okay to have that. Many of, I can just see from the list that many of you are already contributors and have access. But following the becoming a contributor section on the website to sign the contributor agreement and then request access to JIRA is the process to go through for that. As I said, comments are always okay. That's always fine on any issue. Edits. If you're going to really be editing the issue and making updates to it, it is helpful if you use the assign to field so that you can let people know that you're, working on this issue right now. And it's helpful then also to unassign it once you get done working on it so that other people know. And if it's already assigned when you go in to look at it, then it is certainly polite to ask that person if you can find them either on JIRA or in other places in the world. It's polite to ask. You don't have to wait forever. If you ask and you don't get an answer in a day or two, it's fine by me if you just take it over and say, I'm going to start working on this. Because it's often that people, just set it and then forget about it. So where to start? So these are cues. These are all links to things. And these same links are all exist on that screening tickets page. So under each process, you'll see that there are some links to JIRA filters. So for triage, there's the CLJ open filter, which is all things that are open and untriaged. You'll see these are all in open status. The approval field is not set. So these are all things that are open. Like I said, there's lots of these. There's 360 of them. So, go nuts. For vetting, there are existing queues for triage, but in particular, I want to draw your eye to the CLJ 1.12 candidates. This is a set of tickets that Fogus and I went through and hand selected as important bugs to be looked at for 1.12. So this is a particular queue that I would like to clean up so that Rich can look at them. So some of these are pretty gnarly. A lot of them have had a little bit of work done on them, so they're not in general in that bad of shape, but anything you can do to improve these would be helpful. This sort of thing that Fogus and I do sort of in between working on other feature type stuff. So we, sort of cycle in and out of it periodically. The more that you can do to make these better, that would be great. That would be something that Fogus and I can do less of, and we can do more of other things. So most of these are bugs. There are a handful of improvements and features here that were actually in the queue for 1.11 and Rich didn't look at. So I believe most of these more improvement type issues actually have had attention from Fogus and I, except maybe this map merges one, which I just pulled in there. So those probably have had more work done on them. And if you wanted to actually work on fixing these, I don't like most of these have patches. This one is not marked as having a patch, but might. Another thing to mention is that if you look at this filter, you might have different columns. So you can change those by changing the column set that is your default set. Your set is probably different than my set. So you can edit those. Um, and let's see, triage is going to be pretty wide. So if you want to work on stuff there, that's fine. There's no guarantee that the ticket that you look at might be anything that we look at anytime soon. But in general, if you work on things that are higher priority, those are probably more likely to be things that we look at soon. The priorities are not, really super, especially in triage, are not really well filtered, but so out there for screening. Again, anything that's in the 112 candidate list stands a good chance of getting into 112, and that means it's useful to be looking at the solution stuff. Vetted is a set of tickets that Rich has vetted, but are not. Many of those are not targeted to any release right now. So there are things that have already been marked as being good problems, and for a variety of reasons, they may not have been, gotten into a prior release. And there actually are a lot of those out there. If you do want to work on these are generally, a lot of these could probably use help. Some of them are things that really need to be may need to get pulled out. I don't know. So these are in kind of a weird place. If you have questions about those, probably best to talk to us. And then screenable things are things that are sort of gotten into, we're working on them and looking at them. That list is currently empty because we have not started really working on stuff for 112 yet. So there's not much there. As far if you do get into screening and looking at fixes, there's a lot of stuff here about how to evaluate patches. I would encourage you to read all this. I'm not going to go through all that stuff, but there are a lot of tips here about how to do that, what to look for, all that kind of stuff. And that would be appreciated as well. Oops. Oh, I think that's the end. So, oh, and I wanted to mention, if you wanted to look at like prior tickets that have been through all this stuff, I linked to the change log. This is just in the closure Git repo. If you look at, fixed tickets for 1.11, these are all things that have been through this process. So you're likely to see sort of what we're expecting to see. And I would say that like there's a list of things on the at the top of this is sort of what does a good bug ticket look like, and sort of different fields that we're expecting to see in there. You may not see all of these fields on every ticket. We're not dogmatic about it. It's it's not a hard thing to actually make all of these things exactly. But you'll typically see these kinds of things here. Really, when I pick up a ticket cold, I want it to tell a story. I want it to tell a story about here's what a user was trying to do, here's what they did, here's what happened, here's what they expected to happen, here's how I can reproduce that if I haven't already said that. Here is the actual problem or the cause. So they experienced this thing. The reason they experienced is because some root cause. Here's some ways we could fix that. Here's the one I picked. Here's the description of the patch that implements that thing. Like I should be able to read through that whole ticket and have like a really good idea of what happened, how we're proposing to fix it, and all that kind of stuff. Like that's the ideal. And that's what, that's what we try to give Rich is something that is in that state where, and when he gets to screening, like he can screen a ticket in, 5 minutes sometimes. Because if it's well line, if all that information is there, he can just read through it and like it will make sense and we'll okay it. So it goes, so it makes our use of Rich's time very efficient when we do that. So I don't know if I have, there's like this ticket is one I worked on a lot. And this one, it might be instructive to actually go look at what, so the original well, this is the original thing. It's actually came in through Jira, I think. Not through AskClojure, but this is a user reporting a problem and and identifying what they believe is the solution. So it's actually, so there's actually a link here to more background. So the original problem is, I guess I don't have that. That's interesting. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Maybe the link's wrong. Oh, it's getting a comma at the end. I bet you that's what's messing it up. So this is a def test that reproduces this problem. And you look at this and like one of the tests succeeds and one test fails. Like it took me some time to understand what was happening here. It's pretty well laid out, and to use either local or global hierarchies here, or multi-methods, I should say, that have different hierarchies. So that's a good, this is a lot of things that we want here. It's kind of a little bit implicit what the problem is, but I think it's here. When it got filed in Jira, it actually had some patches put on it. Those patches partially fixed the problem, but didn't really find the whole problem. I ended up spending pretty much a whole day on this, tracking this down. There's actually a lot of concurrency issues with it and stuff like that. So this is just a good example of a ticket that went places that I did not expect when I first looked at it. I'm not going to go through all the details of it, but I, literally completely rewrote this issue. It does have some of the stuff in it that's came from the original ticket, but I rewrote some of that. I wrote a lot of stuff here about the cause. It's not important we read all that or understand it all, but it took a while to get to the point where I understood all that. And here you'll see there's a proposal of how that should all happen, and then a patch, and then eventually, got screened by Focus. And you'll see that this is the -4 patch. I mean, went through a bunch. There's a lot of patches out here. So it went through a bunch of different updates on this. We went back and forth on it a bunch. And there's actually a related ticket to this as well. It also got updated and sort of folded in. So it can get kind of messy, but that's the work. Trying to figure all that stuff out. So I guess that's all I had that I was going to blather about. So got about 10 minutes. Do you have questions about how you can help or where to get started that I haven't answered?
So, hi, my name is Daniel. I was just going to say, it sounds like from what you're saying, if I'm, feel very new to it, start with the triaged list and then just from there, pick one that looks a little friendly and and maybe make a comment or two and really understand it, and then try to brush up the fields that need to be included for it to be really considered high quality. And then maybe that would be the first thing I do.
Yeah, and if you have questions, ask in the closure dev room, that's fine. So we tend to watch it, but you know, it might go a day or two without getting an answer or something like that. But yeah, anything you do to move the ball forward on those triage tickets is fine. Some, you know, we have, I know there's lots of tickets that are been sitting out there for a long time. In particular, there's a ton of improvement tickets. But that's just, you know, how it is. And we've been trying to get a little bit better on how we look at the bugs. If you actually narrow it to just non-spec bugs that are in the closure JIRA, there's, I think, 130 something. So there's really not a huge set there. We've been trying to work on bug stuff, the important bug stuff, as the priority.
Yeah, thank you. This is pretty exciting. So I'm excited to try out, you know, working in JIRA and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I didn't go over that details of editing JIRA tickets or any of that stuff. Is that something that people would?
That's something I'm familiar with from my day job.
I mean, JIRA is awful. So but you know, everything's awful in this space. So it just is what it is.
The reason I asked for this pre-triaged thing was to, you know, it's kind of scary for us to make decisions based on, you know, stuff that we shouldn't be making decisions on. But there's also a problem in that the list of open tickets may have been worked upon by someone at some point in time. Or so what I was sort of proposing was if I went ahead and I looked at a ticket that just came in, right? And I did the updates that I thought were pertinent, and then I could signal that, hey, I think this is, you know, in shape for you guys to triage it, rather than I deciding that it was triaged, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I'd say the two ways you could do that. One is by tagging either me or Fogus on the ticket, so you can use a person link. I don't remember what the syntax is, but there's some way to do that.
Yeah.
I'll get a notification about that. Or probably better is actually to put it in the closure dev room and Slack and just say, I looked at this, I think it's ready to mark as triage. What do you think? Whatever it is. I'm happy to look at that. I'm really not concerned about you marking something triaged incorrectly. If you think it's ready, I mean, I'm actually okay with you just marking it as triage. The worst thing is that it will, you know, it'll get looked at again for vetting, and we'll decide differently. So that's no big deal.
What's your thought on closing issues? Because like, is that perceived as a negative thing towards the community, or is it a good, like, I suggested something, and then, you know, even though you say that the future is very long and certainly uncertain, you know, what's your stance on closing tickets, really? That's, I guess, a question.
Well, I would say you probably shouldn't close a ticket, but I might. So if you think it's not a problem, or some, you know, put a comment on the issue or ask me in Slack and we can talk about it. Sometimes I close things, and, you know, I try not to close the door on too many things, but also, like, sometimes it's just not worth having that open and sticking around a JIRA and all these queues if it's not something I think is likely we're going to do. So it's not the end of the world if we close something and then later on we decide to do it. That's fine. We can file another ticket or we can find the existing one and reopen or whatever. So I'm not that worried about it. all these tickets have history on them. So if you do something and it's wrong, you know, we can always, we haven't lost anything. It's there. So it's fine. Any other questions? All right, well, if you feel free to hit us up on Slack. If it would be like, I'm still not sure what will be useful here. Like if it's useful to have just an open-ended chat about stuff every couple weeks, like I'd be happy to do that. So I'll definitely consider that. This is kind of an experiment, trying to figure out what the best way is to work with people. So feedback is welcome.
I guess one thing that's it's really scary to say this, but one thing that might have been missing from this is the problem statement, right? In terms of what are you guys looking for? Why are we?
So there's more than one problem here. So the big problem is that there are a lot of tickets that we've identified for 112, and we are working on other things. And so I would like help in making them good. So the problem is that Focus and I can't do it all. That's the problem. So is that time is finite. So
but are you looking sort of more in the preparation, like the ticket preparation part, more than you're looking into like solutions part, or?
It really both. The place where right now at this moment would be useful is having help on the vetted tickets in those, that candidate list. That's the place where we could use, I think, the most specific help. Some of those have patches on them that need, some of them don't have patches, some of them have patches that haven't been looked at. So there's definitely opportunity there. And what you'll find as you start to work on these is that, like, you'll work on the vetting part of it, you'll get your head into the problem, and then you want to work on the solution too. So like you end up sort of often working beyond just the problem stuff. The problem part is the part that I probably most immediately care about at this moment, but you will inevitably also work on other stuff as well. So sort of related problems are, I would love to have more help, you know, throughout the process. I'd love to have more help on the screening parts of it. If we can sort of, it's one of those things that requires practice. And so like, if I can help, if more of you can help with practicing on that stuff, maybe you'll be, you know, able to help more with other parts of it as well. And maybe we can have a bigger set of people that are sort of actively working on this in the community. And I think that would be good. So. All right. Well,
it works for me because I'm a New Bank shareholder, so everything I can do to contribute just benefits me, right?
Sure. Definitely. We're New Bank shareholders too. So, you know. All right. Well, I'm gonna cut off here. Thanks a lot for listening, and I will see you on Slack, I guess. And I'll think about setting up another follow-up maybe in a week or two. I'm not sure. There's got some travel coming up, but do that in a couple weeks. All right. See ya.